Greetings, this is Artie from Artifact Electronics. Today we're going to look at two things. The first one is the results of our Name That Tune competition. And the second thing is we're going to have a look at how the oscillators, the digital oscillators on the Oscar work. So let's get started with the Name That Tune competition. Now to announce the winner of the Name That Tune quiz competition, and the answer to that is nobody. There were some valiant attempts made, but nobody got the whole thing. And somebody even told me that one of the samples, or one of the tunes I played, was unfair to put in here because nobody would know it. But anyway, the highest scoring participant was Old Bloke H, who got everything except tune number 3. So congratulations on almost being the winner. And the first runner-up was Christoph Scheurig, who got all of the songs right but didn't name the bands. So I would consider him a close second. And what we're going to do is, after this, I'm going to show you the sound clips, and with clear identifications of what sounds or what songs they were. And here's another tune you can chew on. This is not a competition, but let's see if after revealing all of the last Name That Tune answers, if anybody can figure this one out. So put on your thinking caps again, and now let's see what the tunes were. So here's number 1. Number 2. And here's number 3. Number 4. This one still gets played on the radio nowadays. And here's number 5. Now, this one's kind of difficult to play, so bear with me. But shouldn't be that hard to identify. I'll give you a hint. Welcome back, my friends, to the show that never ends. Alright, I'll concede that the tune number 3 was a bit old or too esoteric, and I guess it doesn't appear a whole lot on rock radio stations anymore, but hey, you never know. I figured maybe I'll find a kindred soul on that group, but I guess there's nobody left out there who listens to them. And now to the serious part. How does the Oscar generate its sound? Or how do the oscillators work? Now I sat down and kind of sketched this out, how I could explain this, and after doing a fairly good explanation of how all of this and the next page work, I came up with about 3 episodes worth of material, and obviously that's too much. So what I decided to do was to compress it down to the rest of this episode, about half an episode. And since my viewership is very intelligent, I'll let you figure out the rest for yourself. But I'll do the best to give you the basic strokes of how the oscillators function in the Oscar. So first we got to look at the basic building block of musical sound, which is a sine wave in red, or looks more like dirty brown on the monitor. And I'm sure all of you have seen or had an encounter with a sine wave in school somewhere. But essentially any waveform, all the way up to a square wave, can be built out of several sine waves at different frequencies, and that gets into spectral analysis, which we'll skip over for now. Let's just look at a single sine wave. So in this graph, the y-axis represents the amplitude of the signal, and this, of course, for the Oscar is an electrical signal, a change in voltage, versus the phase angle, or time over here. In more practical terms, you can think of time clicking by as this happens, but using the phase angle designation will make things easier down the road to explain things. So an entire cycle of a sine wave includes a phase angle from 0 through 360. Well, actually, in all honesty and truth, it's not 360, but 0 to 359.9999 period. Because when you hit the 360 degrees is just the start of the next cycle. So if we look at this implementation, we can see that the sine wave is swinging from 0 volts down here up to 5 volts. Now why is that? It's because that's the way the Oscar handles things. It doesn't, it actually generates the entire sine wave in the positive domain of the voltage, and that works just fine, because any DC offset in the sound is usually blocked out by a blocking capacitor before it hits the amp. So the DC offset really is of no consequence to what you hear. But in this case we have a few points marked, so where the sine wave starts over here, the x, or the phase angle, is 0 degrees, and y, the voltage, is 2.5 degrees, 2.5 volts, where it starts out. And then as it progresses, we get to the peak of this first of the positive portion of the sine wave, which occurs at a phase angle of 90 degrees and results in 5 volts. Again, we're speaking about the Oscar. The phase angle is always going to stay the same for no matter what your implementation is, but the amplitude itself is going to be different depending on whether you're pumping out a voltage or a hydraulic cylinder or whatever. So these numbers are, for a 5 volt system, and we can see that the voltage, starts at 2.5, goes all the way up to 5, comes back to 2.5, then drops to 0, and finally goes back to 2.5 again. And that's what you would see on a scope coming out of a digital oscillator. Now, phase angle phi is either in degrees here, or we can also represent it in radians, which would basically run from 0 through 2 pi radians over here. But this is the basic shape of what a sine wave looks like. And now, in order to create music, we got to vary the frequency of this. So let's look into the frequency. So in order to create musical tones, we have to find out what the frequency is. And the frequency is basically defined as the number of times a full waveform occurs in 1 second. And that's usually counted in hertz. I just picked a random not a random frequency, but a frequency off of the well-tempered scale, which is what we use in most modern keyboards. and that's the key A3. It's the key A and 3, meaning it's somewhere near the middle of most keyboards, and that runs at 440 Hertz. You've seen the tuning forks they use in orchestras to tune things. Well, in the old days, I don't think anybody uses a tuning fork anymore, but it's this U-shaped thing that kind of looks like this with a handle. And when you strike, made out of metal, and when you strike this against an object and make it ring, it will basically vibrate at 440 Hertz, and you can tune your violins and douglatches to this, and you know that you have a standard 440 Hertz signal. Now, how does that relate to what we're looking at? Frequency is, we can't write the frequency on any of the axes or anywhere. It doesn't really make sense. So what we do is, if we take the inverse of the frequency, it'll yield the number of milliseconds it takes for an entire cycle to happen. And for 440 Hertz, that happens to be 2.27 milliseconds. So what do we know is that if we digitally generate a single sine wave, it has to take 2.27 milliseconds from beginning to end. And then if we stick several of these together in a long row, we will have a 440 Hertz musical sound coming out. With me so far? Yeah, I'm sure you are. But, that makes for kind of boring music if we can only play the A3 note, and we want to play all sorts of notes. So what that means is we need to alter the frequency of the sine wave being generated dynamically. Initially, just scan the keyboard, see what key is pressed, go to a lookup that will tell you the exact period of the signal, and then either stretch or compress the x-axis on this, and that'll give you a different pitch. So far so good. We now know what the resulting waveform should look like, but how do we generate it? Now we know that this goes from 0 to 5 volts, and basically a digital circuit can't generate. This is an analog voltage required, and we know that digital circuits can only generate a 0 or a 1. So, if 0 is defined as 0 and 1 as 5 volts, well, we can't do a sine wave. The only thing we can really do is a square wave, which if we superimpose it there, if the circuit, it would kind of look like this. It would start at 0, go across, come down, go over, and come back up again. So the blue one, we could generate that directly, hooking some counters together, doing a fractional divisions on the frequency that generates it, using like a 555 timing chip to do it. But again, that kind of limits us, and it is so limited we can't even... We could play some games with changing the duty cycle of the square wave, but that's about as far as we could go. So what do we do if we need to generate an actual sine wave coming out of that digital circuit? So now back to our sine wave. We need to generate a sine wave that oscillates between 0 and 5 volts. And again, we know we can't do this purely digitally, but what we can do is, let's say, for simplicity's sake, let's say we have the values. We use 8-bit values to represent different levels of this sine wave. And so I don't have to draw too much. Let's say we use 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's just put some values in here. 1 here. So these are real numbers. Well, no, they're not real numbers. They're actually integers, since we're still in the digital domain. But the way these would translate is, let's say the center is in hexadecimal. This point say is an 80. Can't draw and twist my arm very well. This would be C0, FF, C0, 80, 40, 0, 40, and 80. This is an example. This would sound horrible. This would actually create more of a triangle wave than a sine wave, but instead of me having to draw 256 points, we'll just use this as an example. So we have a table sitting somewhere in RAM that has these values in it. And the processor could go and look up these values, run a delay loop, then look up the next value. And what it needs to do is basically that data needs to go out through something called a digital to analog converter. Let's just draw it like this. So we have 8 bits coming into this. And on the other end, we have an analog signal that goes from 0 to 5 volts. And this is a D to A converter. So as the processor happily looks up these values and sends them to the D to A sends them out, creates 0 to 5 volts, and that's sent to an amplifier and a speaker, and you will hear a sine wave. So that is the heart of digital sound generation, of how you generate the whole sound. But now remember, we spoke about the frequency, and how do we alter the frequency? Now remember though that the frequency, we have two frequencies we're dealing with here. One is the frequency of the waveform, which extends from the beginning to the end of the waveform. And now we get into a second frequency, and that's called the sampling frequency. And what the sampling frequency describes is at what frequency do we go into our lookup table, read these new values, and send them out through the D to A. And you can immediately see that that frequency is a lot faster than the actual frequency of the sound we're of the waveform, that the desired waveform we're looking at. In this case, since we are looking up 8 sample points, I know it's showing 9, but basically you do this part up to this 40, and then when you're back here, everything resets back to the beginning. So we have 8 samples describing our waveform right now. And if we have 440 hertz, we want a 440 hertz signal, and we're sampling it 8 times, what that means is we end up with a sampling frequency of, yes, I need a calculator for that, 440 times 8. So our sampling frequency, Fs, is 3,520 hertz. So what we need to do is we need to have a table that has the waveform in it. We need to decide how many points of the waveform we have represented in that table, and basically multiply the desired frequency of the sound by the number of samples that represent it. And that is the whole key to doing digital sound generation. So the frequency of the pitch is 440 hertz. However, the sampling frequency is the pitch times 8, because we have 8 samples, which is 3520. And if you take the reciprocal of that, you end up with 284 microseconds. And that is the time from one sample to the next. Now, if we increase the sample frequency, this whole thing, this sine wave, will be compressed this way. And what that results in is a higher pitch. If we decrease the sample frequency, then basically this gets stretched and we get a lower pitch. So what I just described is one of two ways to change the pitch of digitally generated oscillators, and it's called, surprise surprise, a variable sample frequency. Theoretically, it's much easier to explain because you can talk in terms of stretching and compressing this cycle and ending up with the proper pitched frequency coming out in musical form. But it's impractical to do this. It comes with a whole bunch of other problems because there is such thing as sample noise coming through, which gets filtered out, but basically the sample frequency will show up at the output and superimpose itself on top of the resulting waveform, and you need some pretty steep filters to get rid of it. And let's just suffice it to say that this is not a good approach. This is not a good approach to use when you're trying to generate an economical way to generate sound. So then we go on to the way it works on the Oscar. So let's look at this drawn differently, still in the variable sample rate domain. So here's the 8 numbers we came up with that describes the waveform, and these are just 8 sequential locations in RAM somewhere. And for now, let's assume that the processor does this under program control, i.e. we have an assembly language program that goes, picks out a number, sends it through the D to A converter, waits for a certain amount of time, and then takes the next one. And the way you would vary the sample rate is basically the delay loop between taking samples and sending them out could be altered, and thus you would get a different output frequency. And a different way to look at it is if we draw the wavetable in a circular fashion, where, this is the value 80 here, and, it steps through all the subsequent values. With a variable sample rate, our step through the wavetable is always one integer step, i.e. start at an index of 0, or a phase angle of 0, and this representation explains the phase angle a little bit better. But in terms of linear lookup, we take this value, we spit it out through the D to A, we wait for a predetermined amount of time, and then we take our next, then we advance one exact memory location forward, pick the next value, spit it out, and so on and so forth. Now in this case, because we have exactly 8 values, we can just have a modulo 8 counter on the processor side that just keeps incrementing, but it goes from 0 to 7 and then automatically flips back to here. So there's almost zero overhead required for reading this stuff out, spitting it out on this side, and we will just have a sine wave. And then if something else comes in and changes the sample frequency, the time between reading this sample and this sample, the frequency will change accordingly. But as mentioned before, implementing that is it's easy to explain, but it's not that easy or cheap to implement. And so what we do is we basically go to something that uses a constant sample rate. But if you use a constant sample rate, it's always going to play this table at the same frequency, right? We're not changing the sample rate. We decide what it is. Let's say we want to generate a 440 Hertz signal. We come out with the exact delay required from one sample to the next, and we'll sit there with something that eternally plays an A3 at 440 Hertz. So we got to find a way to alter this frequency without changing the sample frequency. And the way we do that is, yes, we have a fixed sample frequency, so that is totally deterministic, but we need to change the amount of time it takes for the sampler to go from 80 to C0 to FF and so on And the way to do that is, instead of having just a simple 0 to 7 number used as an index into the sample table, we use a fractional number, and the fractional number gets updated. So basically, we go through this at the same sample rate, but let's say we start out, our index is 0, and again, in the most simplest form, our increment to go to the that every time we want to pick up a new sample is 1. We'll do it exactly as we did it in the variable sample rate example, because the index is 0 first, we pick this up, next time we add the increment to it, which is 1, so the index becomes 1, and we're just stepping through this table exactly the same way we did before. Now, but what if we use an incremental or a fractional increment as an index to point into this? Let's say our increment is 0.5. So what would happen is, if our increment is 0.5, it would essentially read this sample out twice, because the first time it adds 0.5, our index is 0.5, and because of the digital nature, we drop the fractional part. So we've read it at index 0 and index 0.5 yielded the same value. Now we add 0.5 to it again, our index now turns to 1, and we read the CO. But the next time we come in here, we add 0.5 again, we end up with an index of 1.5, we drop the fractional part, and guess what? It reads the CO again. So right now what it's going to do is, if we had an increment of 1, and let's say we were at 440 Hertz, it would essentially read it out and generate a 440 Hertz sine wave. But if we use an increment of 0.5, the 440, the output that used to be 440 Hertz would now become 220 Hertz. And I'll leave it as an exercise to the viewer to verify that. So now we have a way to generate, if we were actually using fractional numbers, we could come up with an infinite amount of frequencies. But of course, we're dealing in digital electronics with limits. So what we need to do there is basically use lots of bits. And playing tricks like, if you have like an 8-bit number, then the lower 4 bits actually represent the fraction. And you'll basically get a resolution of 4 bits for the fraction. And you're able to change the frequency 16 different times. And that's not enough. So we need to keep throwing more bits at this to get the proper resolution to generate all frequencies, and not only the equally tempered scale, the 12 keys, the 12 different keys you see on a keyboard, but the synthesizer has the glide mode, where it smoothly glides from one pitch to the next. So we need a lot higher resolution to generate something that has, audibly the same frequency control, or gives us the same frequency control as an analog oscillator. But that's it. That's the whole secret to digital audio generation. Greatly simplified. There are a lot of other things to look out for, but this is basically it. If you understand this, you just learned how to generate digital audio signals. Of course, one thing you want to do, this will sound pretty horrible because you don't have a lot of samples. You want to increase the number of samples you use. And that'll generate a more accurate waveform. The waveform we did before, I didn't draw it, but with these sample points, our waveform, which was supposed to be a sine wave, would look something like this, a triangle. And the only way we're going to get closer to an actual sine wave is if we use more sample points. And as you use more sample points, and for the adventurers of you, you can write a computer program for that, that basically generates 8 samples and then 16 and 32, and kind of look what effect it has on the outcoming waveform as you're increasing it. An interesting part of this is, let's say we used 2 samples. Why not, right? Well, think about it. If we have 2 samples, an 80 and an 80, the resulting waveform would look like this. DC. You basically wouldn't hear anything. Why? Because it'll sample the 80. We basically have our wavetable consists of 2 values. And we are falsifying the original waveform so much it disappears completely. And then as we add more sample points to it, it'll start looking more and more like a sine wave. It'll kind of morph through a triangle wave, and as you continue doing this, it'll eventually turn into a sine wave. The big question is, so how many sample points do I use? And on the Oscar, it uses 256. That's the amount of memory that's available for a wavetable, and that is used as the lookup table. Interestingly enough, if you look at the code, which I think I mentioned early on, it has, 8K of code, and there's nothing. There were like 3 bytes left over in the ROM to do it. And I saw that at one point, there was no way he could fit a 256 byte wavetable in there to describe the sine wave. But the way that was solved is sine wave has a lot of symmetry in it. So if we look at the sine wave and then we cut it into pieces, we can see that the values, let's cut this into 4 pieces. Where's the zero crossing? Here and here. So basically, if we look at this in detail, let's say we have values here. 1/4 of 256 are 64 values. So first we shove out the first 64 values. Now we get to the second part. And if we look at this, it's the same values as in here, except they're read backwards. So what we do here is we read the table instead of from 0 to n-1. For this, we read it from n-1 to 0. And we just got this for free, without any extra memory. Now we come to this one. And this one is, let's see, I always get that wrong. This one is the inverse. Let's call this the third quadrant. It's the inverse of the first quadrant. So we still start reading at at 0 to n-1, except we negate the values. And these, of course, for those of you who haven't figured it out, are hex values. So you negate an 80, it's still 80, but a CO becomes 40, the FF becomes 0, and so on. And that will generate the third quadrant. And the fourth quadrant is both of those, what we did before. We start reading the table at n-1, and we negate the values before sending them out. And that will give you a whole sine wave with a savings of 75, with the final wavetable being 25% of the original required. But I'm just mentioning this to point out to you how stringent memory required, how little memory there was available to the Oscar. But yeah, this sums it up. Also, this drawing kind of explains the phase angle. It shows the relationship of time to phase angle a little bit better, where we're starting off at 0 and we're going all the way around, hitting 90, 180, 270, and eventually ending up at 360, which is 0. So that's it. So now we can actually look at the schematics and see what those have to say. So here's how the Oscar does it. Again, the heart is a Z80A clocked at 4 megahertz. That pretty much handles everything. I mean, it's not just doing setting up waveforms or anything and generating certain dynamic things like the envelope of the sound that's coming out, filter values. It is going in and scanning all of the pots and running those through a D to A to set up the filter correctly and set all the parameters up correctly. So it does a lot of stuff. And as we discussed earlier, doing a waveform under program control, this is not nearly powerful enough to do that. So a rather ingenious system was come up with to let hardware handle the parts that this couldn't handle. Now remember, we're dealing with a constant sample rate over here. And the sample rate, I sat down and I calculated it, and I came up with strange values, so I just stuck a frequency counter on, and it's basically sampling at 50 kilohertz, constant. And remember, so what this does is it changes the table lookup increment. That's how it changes the frequency. And that's the whole trick to what they did here. So it basically, the increment is generated in terms of a divider in the 8253 timer chip. But the way the resolution you need, remember we talked about resolution to get the widest pitch range possible. This doesn't have enough resolution to do that. So the approach that was taken was, let's say a key, the Z80 detects a key press. So it knows what pitch it is, it knows what to set the oscillators to, and figures out what the increment, what the fractional increment for the table lookup should be. It converts that to a frequency, but again, we don't have enough resolution, we don't have enough bits to specify the frequency properly or correctly here to get enough pitches out of it. So what was done is that it comes up with the required frequency and divides it by 32. And that's what it programs this first counter chip with. That basically generates oscillator 1 and oscillator 2 increments, fractional increments on the sample lookup, but it also increments an interrupt for the chip, for the Z80 itself, so it does periodic updates of real-time stuff like envelope modifications and so on. But anyway, we got the stuff coming out of here that's reduced by a factor of 32. It is then run for each channel through a phase-locked loop that recovers that missing 32 factor of 32 and bumps up the fractional counter by a factor of 32. Basically what the phase-locked loops do is they multiply what's coming in here by 32 and thus reach the higher frequencies required to get the proper resolution for doing the sample lookup increment. Goes through this kind of stuff, generates the sync signals here, and what the sync signals are really saying is, remember that if we're doing a really low frequency, I mean the same sample can be spit out several times in a row, and what these sync signals say is, hey, I've actually advanced the sync counter, actually not the sync counter, but the lookup counter actually increased by a value of 1, and we actually have a new sample value available, and this is used later on. But and these are necessary because this runs at a constant sample rate, so it can be spitting out the same value multiple times because it's a low frequency and the increment has not advanced by 1 yet to go to the next sample. But anyway, it uses a Z80 CTC, which is a counter timer chip, but that is basically used to basically say, okay, this fires off, generates the sync signal basically once it says, okay, I've advanced by 1, using the increment specified by the processor. So this is the variable part. This is the part that actually generates the different frequencies and has enough bits in it to give you the resolution necessary. Now another interesting part is here we have a static RAM a 6116, which is 2K of static RAM, which is being used as a regular RAM for the Z80. But if you look at it closely, you'll see that essentially the address bus, the Z80 is connected directly to the EEPROM, but the address bus goes to this stuff here. And what that is this whole section is a poor man's DMA circuit. So what that means is, instead of having a DMA controller, which would have brought the cost up of this, it utilizes the refresh functionality of the Z80. The Z80 is able to refresh dynamic RAM. That was built in. That was one of its major selling points. But since this thing doesn't use any dynamic RAM, the refresh signal is repurposed to activate the DMA over here. And the refresh happens after every instruction is, the Z80 fetches an instruction and then decodes it. And during the decoding phase that is internal to the processor, it basically activates the refresh line and puts a 7-bit address counter, and that was used early on to update 16K dynamic RAMs. But it is used here to actually look up. Well, what happens is when the refresh signal is low, the address coming from the processor, A1 through A8, are blocked through this, and they're actually generated in the counter timer circuit over here. And some of the upper addresses are used from the processor, A9 for instance over here, and A9 and A10 over here, but they're 0. Those two addresses will always be 0 when refresh is active. So it basically goes to the lowest part of RAM, which is the waveform memory. And then the bits that change come out of the counter timer and actually look up the proper sample in here. And that goes onto the data bus. And again, this is the same data bus that the processor is tied to, except of course when it's in refresh mode, it relinquishes the data bus over here and lets the data bus talk directly to the next section. The next section is where the D2A converter is. And again, we can see the refresh signal controlling stuff here that basically latches whenever the refresh signal happens. The new sample value sits on the data bus, and it latches it into this latch over here that feeds the D2A converter. The D2A converter isn't clocked. It's basically a resistor ladder, so it takes a little bit of time for it to convert the digital data to a current, to an analog current coming out of here, and that gets converted to an analog voltage through this op-amp, and then goes through a bunch of analog switches to continue further on. But note that over here also, the D2A doesn't just generate the waveform analog output, but it also generates all of the control voltages needed for filters, VCA, here's the filter Q, the filter frequencies, and just a whole bunch of stuff that is all done with a single D2A converter. This is an 8-bit converter. It's basically a DAC 08. Very cheap. One of the cheapest D2As, not very accurate, but sound is very forgiving when it comes to data conversion. For digital data transmission, you can't lose anything. If your internet connection would lose a bit here or there, you would definitely feel it. If this guy misses a bit here or there, and the analog voltage is maybe read before the 150 nanosecond settling time or nothing, it's not a big disaster, because sound is rather forgiving when it comes to the accuracy of the analog signal. But nonetheless, the signal is then gated through all of these switches, runs through an initial stage of sample and hold stuff, gets to a second sample and hold stage, again through the analog switches here. But note, here's the sync 1 and the sync 2 signals, which means that it only lets the new value go through to this final sample and hold when the counter timer circuit, the Z80 CTC, says, hey, I've actually advanced one step to the next sample value. And so what happens then is the next sample value gets stored in this capacitor and shows up at the output of these buffers. And this is properly labeled oscillator 1 and oscillator 2. And these are the current sample values, the analog sample values that are going to the next stage in the sound. And there's also one more thing that goes in here. Things got cut off, but we can see it here. This is supposed to say to filter in. This is supposed to say to filter in. And this says to filter in, and this is actually, it generates digital noise. So we have oscillator 1, 2, and noise going to the filter in signal. And here's the next page with the filter. Each stage of the filter is made up by of an LM13600, and this is the filter in over here. So the two oscillators and the noise come in here, get filtered. The filter has the control voltages coming from the processor controlling it. It then decides on high pass and low pass depending on what it's connected to in the first filter, and enters the second filter over here that gives it a 24 dB per octave cutoff. And then whatever comes out of here finally goes, again, there's a high pass low pass selector through an analog switch, and it very quickly ends up going through the VCA, which is a voltage controlled amplifier, which basically applies the envelope to the filter, and boom, we have one more buffer and we're at the output. We're done. So we have the fully processed signal coming out here. So the oscillator, the sound generation is coming in over here, both oscillators and noise, and the fully processed sound signal is coming out of here, and this is where you plug in your amplifier. I know that was a lot, but make free use of the pause button, which took me about a year to figure out that it's actually the space key when you're watching YouTube. But use that liberally, go back and forth, look at the stuff. I think that all the information you need is there, but it may have been presented in a sped up manner, so don't feel bad if you have to go back and forth and re-listen to something 2 or 3 times. But I think it's better to do it this way than to do 3 episodes and where everybody would fall asleep. Well, that was a lot to digest, but let's kind of listen to it one more time after hearing all the good stuff that goes on inside it. So our octaves in the middle. So this key, the A, this is the actual A3. Now, to prove the smoothness of the frequency transition, now all the theory we just talked about actually works in here, is, well, first of all, we can switch octaves. It's in the middle octave right now. If we play the lowest note over here and go switch the octave low, it'll go down to here. And by the way, the A3 over here, if I put a frequency counter on it, it should show something close to 440. But it's kind of buried right now, so just take my word for it, or run your own frequency counter. And on the other hand, the highest note we can play when we're on the middle octave, but this we can switch up. You can definitely start hearing some noise in there, but that's when a shitty camera is good, because it probably won't pick up that noise too badly, or then it will, or then again it probably might. But that's really the range of frequencies you can get out of the keyboard. And now for the intermediate frequencies, because on a synthesizer one thing that's used a lot is a glide. So what a glide really means, a normal glide, is that you can, I'm playing this lowest note, so when I play a higher note right now, it jumps to it immediately. But if I start turning on the glide, the time on the glide, and it's set to normal right now, it will smoothly change to whatever the destination note is. So notice it was pretty smooth. You couldn't hear it stair-stepping, i.e. it wasn't getting stuck. It didn't sound like somebody was playing the keys really quickly, but it rather just slid up and down. Now, the stair-stepping can be demonstrated with a different type of a slide, and that's called a glissando. And what that does is, instead of smoothly saying, hey, this is my destination, I'm going to smoothly increment the frequency till I reach it, in the glissando, it will unsmoothly increase the frequency, and the steps will be basically each semitone. So now, with that turned on, so what that does is somebody's actually playing all the keys in chromatic order, i.e. in sequential order, really quickly. So that's another thing. It's kind of what you hear when people pluck a harp. It's doing a glissando on the harp. It's actually playing individual semitones instead of smoothly going from one to the next. But that isn't used a whole lot with synthesizers. We usually go back to normal. And there you go. The theory works. That's how it does it, and to me, I mean, this is nerd heaven. It's pretty amazing how this got implemented in hardware. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, and comment. And I will see you next time.